In the civil rights movement, I became active in 1960 around the sit-ins, but in support of them. But in 1964, I went to Mississippi with the Freedom Summer Project. Many of you may have heard about the Summer Project. This was a time when the lives for poor Black people in Mississippi was really a state of terror. And it seemed like in Mississippi, not much more could be done. And so there was an attempt to get the attention of people from the North down south, and students came down. Marshall Gans, who was part of the wonderful training, wonderful organizing mentor for so many, he was also part of the Summer Project with hundreds of others. I was 18 years old, and the attempt was to shine a spotlight on what was happening in Mississippi. It became more infamous because early in the summer, 3 young volunteers, Andrew Goodman, James Chaney, and Michael Schwerner, were murdered at the hands of the Klan. You may have heard about those murders, but what you may not know is that while they were looking for the 3 young men, they found the bodies of 8 other Black men whose hands had been bound or feet chopped off, one in the Tallahatchie or Pearl River. They lived in such a state of terror that those disappearances hadn't even been reported. And when they found the bodies, they weren't really investigated, and they were treated as cold cases 20 years or more later, when finally some of them were resolved. Black lives did not matter in Mississippi in 1964. This is me at 18 years old in Shaw, Mississippi. We were doing voter registration, just engaging people, and then we were picked up just before what was my first arrest. This is Fannie Lou Hamer. I'm at her house in Rollville, Mississippi. She's there with 2 of her friends. She was a great heroine, both of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, as well as a great heroine, really, to all of America. There I am playing the guitar. She was a courageous leader, and when the Democratic Party and the Republican Party wouldn't let an integrated registration, integrated participation, she became co-chair of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party with Reverend Ed King. Whoop. Now, moving from a time of such terror, because people organized in Mississippi, door to door, house to house, speaking to people, building a base, engaging people who are really affected by the conditions, because of the bravery and courage of people in Mississippi, and because of the alliances built and the additional power brought to bear from around the country. Within a year, there was a Voting Rights Act, and Mississippi now has more African American elected officials than any other state in the country. Now, we still know there's a long way to go. There is incredible pushback. Trayvon Martin, Freddie Gray, names that we may not even know yet. We know there's a pushback on voting rights, on civil rights, but we make progress when we organize. I returned to my campus in 1965, and the women's movement was emerging. This is from one movie. Telling the truth is very revolutionary, and we need to speak truth to power, as Julian Bond said from the civil rights movement, and one movement trains and teaches another. One action of organizing, one campaign I was in the early women's movement, was in the early 1970s. I was a young mother with 2 little kids, Jean and Dan right there, and loved those kids. And like many women of my generation, wanted to return to work. But in order to do that, we needed to have high-quality childcare available that we could afford. And in the city I lived in, Chicago, there was no paid childcare. There was no city-funded childcare. So we decided to set up our own childcare center. It would have been the Sojourner Truth Center, but when we went to the city to try and set it up, we were sent on an endless loop of 32 different offices, and then back to the first one, not having made progress and getting even one permit. We realized we really needed to organize, and so we set up an organization. We set up the Action Committee for Decent Childcare, ACDC. Get it? We were part of organizing for all people for childcare. There I am as a young mother with my son Gene in a demonstration we had for childcare. And what we decided was that our goals would be, our long-term goal would be free 24-hour client-controlled childcare. That was the sign, because we felt people had 24-hour shifts. We'd only put children in, of course, for a short period of time, but there were for people on night shift, day shift. We also wanted free, a long-term goal. But we decided also that the city should provide funding for childcare and that they had to revamp the childcare licensing laws so that you don't have 32 stops without making any progress. We then organized. We went into, we asked the head of one of the departments that we thought might have a role on childcare and asked for a meeting. And because we didn't have the power at the start to actually win fully, we said, well, could you do a study about what childcare was available and what was needed in the city, and then we could evaluate it. She agreed to meet with us, but not agreeing to the study. We brought 30 women with our children down to City Hall. It was very intimidating. Some of the women had never been downtown without their husbands before. It was an integrated group. That was racially integrated. That itself was pretty shocking in those times. We go down their marble walls and long halls, and it was very frightening. We get into the room, and the woman we were supposed to meet with isn't there. We decide to wait. Some said, well, let's leave. We decided to wait. We're waiting, and the kids are getting a little agitated. We start by singing, row, row, row your boat, and then we sing, we shall not be moved. And then some of the kids need a diaper change. We're a little embarrassed, but we start to change the diapers. We say, what will we do with this? And then we realize, she's given us the poop. Let's give it back to her. We put it on a table. We put a big ribbon around it with a note, and no more poop. So, and then the kids start rifling through the files. They're getting a little bored. And we say, no, stop that. Don't do that. And then we realize, no, we're looking for the study. Do that. And we find the study. At that point, we call the press. The press shows up miraculously. The woman we're supposed to meet with, the administrator, comes in and says, oh, I didn't know you were waiting. Oh, I'm so sorry. Oh, you wanted a study. We don't have the study. Oh, you found the study. And we then pressed for an intermediate demand, which would be hold hearings around the city in every city council or aldermanic district so that we can then use that for further organizing. We did, and within less than a year, organizing parents and childcare providers and from faith communities and from others in support of knowing that corporations and others who knew that women needed to return to the workforce, just a few corporations, we won, and the daycare rules were revised. We won a panel made up of parents and childcare providers to, in an ongoing way, review childcare in the city, and we won $1 million for childcare when $1 million was real money. And that was from organizing. Now the struggles continue. I became a labor organizer, and in 1968, many of you may have heard about the struggle in Memphis. Next year will be the 50 years of the Memphis sanitation workers' strike. Let me tell you the background of the strike. All the sanitation workers, the garbage men, were African American. They were mistreated in that they had low wage, poor protective clothing, poor security standards. And they also had to stay by their garbage trucks during torrential storms in Memphis. And you know how a garbage truck has a big maw in the back. To get out of the rain without protective clothing, some of the men went into the back of the truck. There was no protection on the gear. Someone hit a gear, and the men were crushed. The men went to management and said, we want a union. We can't be treated like this. We need protection. And management said no. They went out on strike, and here was the famous picture, I am a man. All the garbage workers, the sanitation workers there were men at that time. Dr. King was brought down to the strike, and he was killed. But because people organized in Memphis and around the country, because the message was sent out, the story was told, they won their union. Now we know the struggle continues. This is the struggle of the fight for 15. No one who works should live in poverty. And the fight for 15 will help raise the floor. We know there's also a pushback on labor rights. This is Governor Walker in Wisconsin. And he is standing with people as he is signing the legislation undermining collective bargaining in that state. We know there's a pushback, but when we organize, we can win. With money I won from a back pay suit, I started a training center, partly saying I'll never get fired again. I started a training center called Midwest Academy. Here's the manual of Midwest Academy. And there are 3 basic principles of the organizing that we encourage. They're part of also developing a strategy. One is to give real improvements in people's lives based on our values that we explain to people and that they know they're fighting for something concrete in addition to justice, freedom, democracy. Important as those are, they also are fighting for air they can breathe, to walk the street safely, to have more money in their pocket. They know what the struggle is for. The second is to give people a sense of their own power. So they're not gaining something because a benevolent elected official or corporate head or administrator has given something, though I'm all for that, but it's because people were involved in the struggle and won this themselves. And therefore they'll be stronger and more confident for the struggles in the future. And the third is that you win structural reforms. That means holding those in power more accountable so they are less the unaccountable power we currently see. And there are patterns in place, structures in place for the future. It also means building our own organization. And a key thing is organizers organize organizations. So you're there to fight for the next day. On immigration reform, because this is the last one I'll go over right now. I've got 1492 because as long as there were immigrants coming to this country, there has been a battle for immigration reform in one way or another. And the same is true of every struggle. They start at the back when the first people feel that kind of oppression, and they continue on now and into the future. These are the beautiful pictures of the We Are America rallies throughout the country, celebrating this country, saying, we are this country. We are America. It's all of us, all of America. And here again, I start with an arrest. This was another arrest. One of the many tactics, but only one, that we take in this struggle. When immigration reform was starting, when I was starting at least working on it, perhaps 30% of the country believed that there should be a pathway to citizenship. That figure is nearly 70% now. People believe we should be a welcoming country. And that's happened only because people have organized. And if we organize, we can change this world. It is not a question of if, it is only a question of when, if we organize. So I thank you for the organizing you've done and that you're about to do. And I welcome you to the resistance. But it is more than resistance. It is resistance. It is organizing, meaning reaching out, talking to people we might not otherwise be talking to motivate those who weren't involved, and for those who didn't think they even wanted to be related, finding ways to persuade them. So motivation and persuasion, building our power, resistance, organizing, moving it into elections,